Frank Herbert's Dune. Now, this is not only the best sci fi book that I have read personally, it's many people's favorite sci fi book of all time, and for good reason. This book met all of my expectations and more. This is also just one of the best books in general that I've read. Frank Herbert has honestly created one of the best and most realized and deep worlds that I've seen to this point in my reading. Um, Learning more about the man himself just continues to astonish me. Even just reading, the appendices in the back of the book where he talks about the ecosystem of Arrakis, which is the main planet that the story takes place on, the background of the Bene Gesserit, the religion of Dune. I mean, this guy put a ton of years into creating this world and the characters and the lore behind it before he even wrote the books, and that is truly impressive. Now, I'm sure a lot of writers do this. Robert Jordan probably did this. George R.R. Martin, Tolkien. I mean, some of the titans of fantasy and sci-fi, I'm sure all share a very similar trait in the love and care that they put in to these stories. Dune was written in 1965, I believe, or at least that's when it was published. And this holds up for sure. This is not like an old sci-fi book that's, in my opinion, hard to get into. This is not some like old English fantasy story where the writing is inaccessible. This book was great, and I have quite a few reasons why. What I will say up front is I do recommend that everyone who has read sci-fi read this book. It is fantastic. And if you've read anything such as the authors that I just mentioned, whether it be Wheel of Time, A Song of Ice and Fire, pretty much any sci-fi that exists today, Star Wars, this book laid the foundation and groundwork for a lot of those to exist and is probably directly, at least in some way, responsible for the success of those and the creation of those ideas and those stories, because this book was fantastic. And the ideas that are put forth in here by Frank Herbert are truly incredible. Not even just for the time that this book was created in. Again, this is almost 60 years old now. This was just so well crafted, from the planets themselves to the characters to the themes and the message behind it all. This book is great. So the way that the story is set up, the history of Dune is that humanity essentially had a war with artificial intelligence, robots, long ago. And after defeating that, they basically outlawed computers, AI, anything that would resemble human intelligence, because they didn't want that to happen again. So in this sci-fi world, while there are spaceships, there is interplanetary travel. This is not your typical sci-fi with a lot of space lingo from like the ships and space stations and computers and things like that, because computers are actually outlawed in the society 20,000 years in the future. There is essentially a ban on creating AI that resembles human intelligence. So the way that they've kind of not necessarily circumvented that, but recreated that or restructured that, is there are these people called mentats who are effectively living computers. They're human beings that have kind of transcended human processing, and they are almost acting as if they are artificial intelligence. So these are very important people in society. Another part of the society is each planet in this universe now is controlled by a royal family. So yeah, it almost has like a quasi medieval or like feudal age feel to it, where there are warring families, and there's families like royalty in charge of entire planets. So the Atreides family, which Paul is our main protagonist, and his father, the Duke, control Caladan, and they are actually given control of Arrakis, which is the desert planet, also known as Dune, that you see in everything. If you think about Dune, you think about the desert planet of Arrakis. They are given control of Arrakis, and Arrakis is home to what is known as a spite called melange, which is basically the central focus of the story, because this spice kind of goes into everything. It's the main part of this world's economy. It helps space travel. It's how you fuel ships. It is worth a lot of money. And essentially, being in control of it kind of puts a big target on your back, which leads to the main story of, if you read the back of the book, you read descriptions of it, them being in control of this spice really kind of tells everybody, here you go. Like, the Atreides family is in charge of this. They have money and power. It's probably going to lead to some bad shit, right? This spice is also how Mentats power their abilities. This is how the Bene Gesserit and others are able to use powers as well. The Bene Gesserit, for those of you that don't know, are sort of like I almost liken them to wizards or witches in this universe. Obviously, this is a very sci-fi forward story with fantasy elements, but it's very clear that the Bene Gesserit, as others have said, is where Robert Jordan pulled the Aes Sedai from for the Wheel of Time. The overall story of Paul Atreides and his sort of path, while different, is clearly where George Lucas got the idea for Star Wars from. Tatooine is very similar to Arrakis. Sandworms are very similar to a Sarlacc. I mean, there are a lot of parallels to draw between what Star Wars pulled from Dune, what Wheel of Time pulled from Dune, the magic system. There's a female side and a male side to the magic system in Wheel of Time. There's a male side and a female side to, I don't want to say the magic system, but there is a system in Dune that functions based on whether you are a male or a female. A Song of Ice and Fire, the politicking, the warring families, down to some things that I know of that are briefly mentioned in Dune, but I believe take place in further on in the series, line up very directly with things that George R. R. Martin writes about in A Song of Ice and Fire. I mean, you look at a lot of these stories that exist today, they pulled a lot from Dune, and that is because the story is so rich and dense with information and ideas, and it's not that long. It's just over 600 pages, and then you have some appendices furthering the lore and the background of the story and the planet and the characters. As short as this book is, it has so much in it that it obviously and clearly influenced sci-fi and fantasy as we know it today. And it's fantastic to see just how well constructed this was, because I absolutely adored this book. I kind of had an idea going into it that I was going to like it, and it blew me away. So continuing on with the basic plot of this story. So House Atreides takes over control of Arrakis. They're basically betrayed by these Harkonnens that they've been, at war with for years and years and years, which kind of thrusts Paul into the center focus of the story. Now, this almost reads, if you read a description about it, it talks about how Paul needs to, transform or grow, evolve into the Muad'Dib, which it almost reads exactly like a Chosen One trope or a Chosen One story. It really isn't. It kind of takes the Chosen One story and deconstructs it in a way to where this is not just like boy grows up to become savior, beats everybody and wins. Like, this is not what this story is. And while some of it kind of reads that way in a sense, it's really not. And the more you read into what's behind the characters in the story and the meaning of the book, it's very clear that this is mostly a deconstruction of the Chosen One trope that I believe Frank Herbert wanted to tell, because it really isn't a savior story. This talks a lot about how you shouldn't put your faith into a single man or a single entity. You can't just rely on one person to solve all your problems. And that's what's so interesting about this book, is that whether it's the religion or the politics or just these warring houses, political maneuvering, control of power and money and wealth, just this book tackles so many of these aspects. Power is not everything. Control is not everything. There's always going to be somebody that's waiting to take it from you. This really tells you that religion, like, you shouldn't necessarily just follow a messiah or somebody who fits the description of a story that you want to be fulfilled. And that's what I mean by it kind of turns the chosen one trope on its head, because it's not as if there is just a prophecy that somebody fills and then the story's over, like, hurrah, they win, they're the good guy, they defeat evil, because that's not what this book is at all. And if you look beyond the surface of it and you actually read and pay attention to the text, this is very much turning against what is a traditional chosen one story, while also kind of reading as one. So as far as a couple of other things that I really loved about this book, because I don't want to say too much about the plot and the story necessarily, because I don't want to spoil it. I know it's an old book, but a lot of people still haven't read it. This was my first read of it. I loved it so much that I bought the next 5 books in the series because I want to see where it goes. But I had heard a lot of negativity towards the book as far as like the writing style or the character work or things like that. So first of all, the characters. I did not like Paul initially. I didn't dislike him or anything, but he wasn't like, I wasn't immediately attached to him. He grew on me a lot throughout the book, and the way that the book is structured, much like if you've read a Stormlight book where there's part 1, 2, 3, and 4, this is split up into books 1, 2, and 3. So it is telling one consistent story, but there is a bit of a time difference between the books. Sometimes the POVs will change, and I think the main thing that I've heard about people disliking about the writing style is because this is third person omniscient, so you're bouncing between different characters' POVs while also having kind of like an overhead omniscient narrator that can be in everybody's head. So you get a lot of internal thoughts from various characters, sometimes on the same page in the same scene. I understand that can be confusing for some. I never really got taken out of it. I didn't personally think it was that hard to follow along with. And I think as long as you are actually actively reading and paying attention to who's talking, it's not really that difficult. It's definitely not something that's super streamlined and easy to follow as like a Sanderson novel, where it's very clear who's talking, who the chapter is about, things like that. This will bounce around from character to character, from internal monologue to another character's internal monologue. So I can kind of understand why that turns people off, but I think he does that purposefully. And I've seen a lot of complaints about like repetition or characters kind of like repeating the same thing in their head over and over again. One, I think that's a bit exaggerated for one. Two, I think it helps to tell you whose character's head you're in to make sure that you're not confused during the story. And also, 3, the main critique that I see of that is based on a single character that happens pretty early on in the book. And the reason behind that, if you understand what this character is and why they're repeating that, and it makes sense if you actually understand why that character is the way that they are. So just read what's on the page, pay attention to why a character would do a certain thing, and I think that tackles a lot of the confusion that people read or have when they read this story. Because honestly, I never really felt like I was lost while reading it. Aside from the typical, like, this is a sci-fi book, you're going to get a lot of terminology thrown at you, things like that, that you aren't going to know what it means right away. You're going to hear things right up front, like Bene Gesserit or Gam Jabbar or Muad'Dib. You're not going to know what the hell is happening. And right as I didn't know what was happening, Paul, the main character, was like, what do these words mean? So, I mean, it's a sci-fi book. You're going to have a glossary at the back of the book if you need it. You go into it not necessarily being handheld. You are expected to follow along and understand as you go. You're not going to be given all the information up front, and I don't think you should be. Like, you're put into this story for a reason, and then you're going to learn more about what they are as the book continues and grows. I thought this book was paced wonderfully. The first 100 pages or so, they're not even at Arrakis yet, but as soon as you get to Arrakis, everything really takes off. I've heard people quitting the book around a particular dinner scene that happens because it's a sort of drawn out chapter or chapters where there's a lot of political maneuvering and discussions and things like that. I love that, so it was not a turnoff for me whatsoever about the book. That's some of the best stuff that I love about A Song of Ice and Fire, for example, is that whole scheming and you know, behind the back deals, things like that. That's the stuff that really sets the stage for what's happening in this book. And I say that because this book is not full of action. This is not Rage of Dragons or something that I love too, where it's nonstop action paced. This is not giant space battles happening. Like, the few battles that are prevalent in this are a little bit smaller scale, and then the main battle of the book isn't even the focus of the chapter that it's in, because that's not the point. Like, Dune is not, and I've only read this one, I've not read the rest of the series. Dune, this book right here, is not about the action. This is about themes and critical thinking and really making the reader think about the things that they're seeing on the page, and making you think about things that you're used to seeing that you might not necessarily put a lot of thought into, whether it be religion or a chosen one, or violence or power or money or control. It tackles all this in about 600 pages, and it's absolutely crazy to me that he was able to pack in so much knowledge and care and just finesse with these themes, that I'm excited to continue, and I hope that it kind of keeps that same theme going, at least through the 6 that he's written. But I was just really blown away. This is the kind of story where the reason you see channels like Quinn's exist, or other, I'm sure there's plenty of Dune channels that exist. Quinn is the example I'm using because I love his content. But this story has brought so much discussion and laid the foundation for so much of sci-fi and fantasy as we know it today, that it's the kind of story that you just want to dive in deeper and learn more about the lore. Like, I've never finished a book and wanted to read an appendix about it. I immediately started reading the appendix of this book because I just wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about the Bene Gesserit, or like the religion or the background. Like, why are they in this place 20,000 years in the future? What happened in the past to lead to this point? Like, I really just wanted to soak in more. Learning that Arrakis has its own ecosystem, that the author, Frank Herbert, created to make it fully realized and make sense, and that there's strict rules and behaviors that creatures follow. I mean, the extent that went into creating this story in this world is truly incredible, and I would recommend that everybody read this, because it's fantastic. I don't know how else to put it. Like, this is one of those stories that when you hear about the greatest sci-fi of all time, this truly lives up to that. And if you've read a lot of more modern stuff and then go back and read this, 100% I believe you will see where a lot of that came from, because this guy was way ahead of his time. He was incredibly intelligent. And this is almost like when you go back and read a Crichton novel, where you realize how long ago these books were written, and how much of what they wrote then has come to fruition today, whether it be in the real world or in sci-fi and fantasy writing. It's truly incredible, and my hat's off to Frank Herbert for just having the brilliant mind and forethought to create such a vibrant and living world, and I cannot wait to continue with this story. The last thing I want to say about this story, because I feel like this is not just a book review, this is sort of a why you should read, and just everything that you should think about while reading or after reading Dune, because it's truly a masterpiece in my opinion. It deals with so many just truly impactful and thought-provoking themes. I mean, just the fact of, like, humanity versus AI. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be an animal? Like, what separates us from an animal? But this gives, in my opinion, a very grounded and somewhat realistic, while sort of, in a lot of ways, depressing view of what could potentially be a future for humanity 20,000 years from now. This is very much a more grounded, realistic approach to what would humanity and civilization look like 20,000 years from now. How could you structure that while tackling all these different themes of, like, what would happen to a religion, that many decades from now, 20,000 years? Like, what would humanity look like? What would our resources look like? What would planets look like? Like, what would these ecosystems look like and function? How would people deal with water on a desert planet of Arrakis? Like, water plays a massive part of this book because you're on Arrakis. That's the focus. Like, Arrakis is almost its own character because of how in-depth and thoughtful Frank Herbert was while creating it. Just like I said, like the guy created his own ecosystem for it. It's insane. But just like, what else do you say about this book? It's fantastic. I loved reading it. I was never bored. I was engaged entirely through the whole thing. I did actually use the audiobook a little bit as well. And I know that I think some content is cut a little bit from it. I don't know what exactly is cut out because it's a multi-person audiobook to kind of give you a better feel of like it's almost like a movie or a play. And I feel like that helped set the tone for enjoying this adventure that I was on, because there's music, there's multiple characters, there's multiple actors. It helped bring it all to life for me, and reading it obviously is the best way to experiencing it. Well, reading it is obviously the best way to experience it, but I also enjoyed very much having the audio there as well. And just this really left an impact on me, and just seeing clearly how much what we read today pulls directly from Dune. I think Frank Herbert was a genius in writing this book. I recommend that anybody that loves fantasy or sci-fi read this book. I think it's fantastic. Highly recommend it. I don't know what else to say other than doing a whole spoiler video, which is a whole nother thing. I mean, if you want spoilers, you want deep dives into lore and characters and everything behind this, go to Quinn's Ideas. The guy has an entire Dune playlist. Go to Mike's channel, listen to his Why You Should Read if you need more convincing of why you should read this book, because he's been a fan of this for far longer than I have. But I'm very glad I read this. I wanted to get this done in time for the movie. The movie got delayed. Whatever. I'll probably have read the entire 6-book Dune saga that Frank Herbert wrote before the movie comes out. I can't wait to continue it. I loved it. I recommend it. I think you all should read it if you haven't already. If you have read it already, please drop in the comments and talk to me about it. Hop in the Discord, continue the conversation there. As always, like and subscribe if you do enjoy the channel and the content. Feel free to donate to the Patreon if you enjoy this content as well. It does obviously help me out and continue with my book buying sickness, we'll call it. But yeah, guys, Dune is great. I love it. Now I can show this book with pride on my shelves because I have actually read it, and it was incredible. So until next time, everybody, keep reading.